Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week, we dive into the stories, technology, and ideas shaping a profitable and sustainable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast. Today, we have the second segment of a two-part series. And the first part you can hear from last week, where I talk about how I was at a really interesting meeting that AB Vista, which is a feed additive company, put on that I was able to attend. They took us through a tour of the Ford factory in Dearborn, Michigan, where F-150s are produced, and related that back to farming and production agriculture. So this is one of the other talks that I found really interesting by somebody that I've gotten to know over the last few years, Barry Bradford. Now, Barry heads up a lot of the dairy research at Michigan State University, my alma mater, and have many interactions with Barry over the last few years, and really enjoyed getting to know him. And he's a very humble guy, very knowledgeable person, and very practical as well. That's what I love about him as a researcher. He's always relating it. How do we bring this back to the farm? How do we make this make sense to implement on farm? So he did a really interesting talk about how he looks at putting together research projects and some of the pitfalls and interesting findings that he's had over the years, as well as how to set that up on your own farm if you're looking at doing a study on your farm that you're interested in trying something new and really digging into the details to figure out if what you're doing is going to show you results or not. So I think this pertains to a lot more than the dairy industry, even though he's using dairy industry specific anecdotes in his talk. I think there's a lot of knowledge and information here that anyone in any sector of agriculture can take to heart if they're interested in doing their own trials, or when they're really looking at trying to figure out if a product or solution on their farm is going to work for them or not, and digging into how that data that they're looking at to make that decision is meaningful. So the same thing on part one of this series. The sound quality isn't quite up to the specs that we usually like to have here on the podcast, but the information that Barry shares is very relevant, and I think it's worth listening to, even though the sound quality is not like I would like to have it. So please keep that in mind. You might hear some doors slamming in the background and some things like that, but I still think you will find this very valuable. So as always, listen up and hope you enjoy this episode with Dr. Barry Bradford.
So without further introduction, that's not necessary to do or anything, but turn things over. Now we get to some of the practical approaches, maybe build around some things we've talked about. And at the end, I'm going to make the argument, there is no difference in industries, and there is no difference between what you saw today and the dairy farm. There's no difference.
So I work I'm trained in nutrition. I do a lot of nutrition work, but also my role now is dairy management. And so I'm going to talk more narrowly about, how I think about making decisions on using feed additives, and then we'll apply some of that sort of data analysis to that. So this is what I use in a MSU class that I teach in. The classic term I heard it this morning is foo-foo dust or magic dust, right? And then I work with people who sell products that are very effective, so I don't mean that to run every feed additive into the ground. It's just a joke, right? But it is a fair question, especially if it's a technology you're not familiar with the science behind, or whatever. Somebody's coming, you're busy, your phone's ringing. I talk to dairy farmers all the time. I know it's like bzz, bzz. So you don't have days and days to sit there and study the literature on this. How do you go about deciding what really matters to a business, right? Is this profitable? And so to start with, I think, to a business manager, this sounds pretty easy. Okay, well, what does it cost? That's almost always one of the first questions, which is entirely rational, right? So you need to know that. And then, what's the additional revenue it will generate? And then it's pretty simple math, right? is number 1 greater than number 2, right? Unfortunately, that may be overly simplistic. What are some reasons why that may not be a sufficient analysis? What's that?
You don't have reduced operating costs.
Okay, are there savings beyond additional revenue?
How big is the turnaround?
Yeah, how long does it take to see a response? Yeah.
Year.
How many days have you spent cost per cow per day before you see the revenue? Yeah, that's a good one.
Milk price due in between.
Yeah. You don't always know, right, what the value of the milk, the extra milk is going to be when it comes. Those are all good. Is the revenue, well, we'll get into the rest. So those are all some pretty good points. Here's some things, that I came up with. Well, is it a huge pain to deliver? Will it actually cost you labor, beyond just a normal another ad? On the benefit side, are there long-term effects that aren't going to show up next week? And Doc kind of alluded to that. What about, does it have cow health benefits? And how do you put a dollar sign on that? You can. There's people that work on that, but it's not something you can easily do on the back of a napkin. Other potential benefits or harms, right, that also are difficult to put numbers to. And then another one, does it actually help the calf, right? And if it's a heifer that's going to be a replacement heifer, that's potentially benefits over 3, 4, 5 years, right? Just one little example from our research. This is a study feeding choline to cows through the close-up period and the fresh period, and something we didn't anticipate on this study, but we found a really remarkable impact is on colostrum yield. So you can see there was like an 80% increase in colostrum yield for cows that got either of the 2 doses of choline. Okay. Elias said, absolutely. And I was laughing when you said, well, you're not guaranteed a result when you go to university. Just a little side story there. I did a project with a company, you guys wouldn't know them anyway, out of Wisconsin, sponsored when I was back at Kansas State. And the results it wasn't like it did nothing. The cows dove in milk production, and there's a whole story behind that. Well, at the end, we sent the final report, and like the head honchos of the company got on a conference call with me one day, and they said, well, we invested in this as part of our marketing plan, and didn't turn out how we thought, so we don't want you to publish this. And I was like, half laughing, half super angry. I'm like, go read the contract we signed 1.5 years ago. It's going to get published. Sorry. And if anything, that made me more motivated to publish it. Because I'm like, we're not your marketing department. I'm sorry. Anyway, so just to give some background, I don't get hired to pitch things, so I don't want it to sound that way. But it's interesting because I think the choline data is now pretty strong, but there's a lot of farms that this was a pain point for them. It wasn't necessarily about doing the math on return on investment. They were so sick of running out of colostrum in October every year and then paying through the nose for colostrum replacement, right? They're like, well, we're going to try this. And, I don't know what the success rate was, but several producers told me 1 year later that was the least problems they'd have with colostrum through the fall in a long time. So just an example, right? Like that wasn't necessarily the perceived ROI going in, but it resolved a problem on the farm that had a real cost, right? So some of these things are not so easy.
We don't sell coal.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's true.
There's no hidden advertising.
But on a lot of these things, as a scientist, my job really is to ask, are there plausible benefits of different things we can try? And then how reasonable is it for us to try to test whether it actually has that benefit, right? So you could say, for example, there's some really cool data on heat stress having impacts on granddaughters now. Okay, if a company came to me and said, hey, we think we can prevent the granddaughter harm from heat stress if we feed this product. The budget I'm going to come back with to actually test that is going to be very large because we've got to track animals for multiple generations. It's just the practicalities of actually designing an experiment for that are very hard. So that's why sometimes, even though maybe one of the biggest benefits of feed additive X is on fertility, I know that I probably have to design a study with 1,000 cows to actually properly test whether it improves fertility, right? And it's very difficult to do. It's much easier for us to test, does this change milk yield next week, than some of those outcomes, okay? So that really feeds into this, this book has come up, it's weird, like 3 or 4 times in the last 2 months in different meetings I've been in. And so I bought it, and I'm about halfway through, but it's a little slow for my taste, but it's really interesting. This lady is like clearly brilliant. She was in the middle of her PhD, kind of had like a early midlife crisis or something, and went to go hide in Montana for a few months and got hooked on poker. And she ended up basically making millions and millions in Vegas on poker. But she's talking about in this book what she learned by learning how to think about making bets, and she applies that to more important things than poker, right? So a couple takeaways from this I think are useful to think about. Most decisions in real life come with uncertainty, right? And listen to politicians, that's never true, but most people that are good at managing a business recognize that. And I think this is a more important or maybe less people get to this on their own. There's almost very, very few decisions that are completely right or wrong. It usually comes down to, if you're a good manager, playing the odds right and recognizing that sometimes you made the right decision, and because of factors you can't control, the result was negative. But she really spends a lot of time on learning to recognize that, hey, at the time with the information I had, this was still the right decision, or being willing to reflect and say, actually, I didn't consider this, that was a poor decision, even if you got lucky sometimes, right? So there's not a direct correlation. Well, there's some correlation, but not 100% correlation between good decisions and good outcomes, or vice versa, okay? But I think that is super important to think about. And if you accept that paradigm, right, we get a stronger relationship. No, I was going to say that wrong. we get better at playing the probabilities right if we have more information. So Craig's model he showed you that had 100 inputs, right? You didn't show the R-squared on that one, but you showed another slide of the 0.92 R-squared. That means 92% of the time the x-axis predicted the y-axis. That's better than we can do in real life on a dairy farm for most things, right? But the point is, the more things you put in the model, the more things you give the computer to use to sort of predict the outcome, the R-squared always gets better. Now, if it's an expensive variable to add, it may not be worth the cost. It may not improve it much, but it always improves the prediction, right? So that's the point, is if we can find high-value information to feed into our decision-making, we're going to get better at predicting the outcome and make better decisions. So if you like reading business books, it's not a bad book at all. It's interesting. All right, so back to this question. How can we better inform these decisions? What information can help us get better at playing the odds right? Okay, again, we all have biases. I'm biased towards peer-reviewed research partly because I know how much freaking time goes into that and how brutal peer review is, and people, studies that make it through are not perfect. Some of them should have made it through, in my opinion, but on the whole, compared to other sources of information, that is the gold standard. I would defend that, okay? Other university studies that are not peer-reviewed, again, they're typically, not always, typically well-designed to sort of set up fair comparisons, and I'll talk about sometimes where field studies fail a little bit in that respect, depending on how well they were planned out. But usually I think of those as the second best source. Field studies, I'll talk about some examples. I will say up front, like I think about research quality, or I shouldn't even use the word research because it doesn't have to be proper research, right? But information, perfect information has internal validity, which means it's a comparison that's completely fair, okay? So for example, an opposite example, I was going to test whether Gatorade made us run faster, and I gave Gatorade to all the people under the age of 30 in the room, and everybody over 30 didn't get Gatorade, and then we went out and raced. I'm pretty sure I would know Gatorade would look probably pretty good. I could maybe beat Kieran, I don't know. So that's an example of terrible internal validity. The study is not valid. The comparison is completely biased. It's not balanced at all. Okay. So an internally valid study is balanced. But you could have a perfectly internally valid study, and the external validity is terrible. One example I used to use in a class I taught was a headline from a British newspaper that said, new study says drinking wet red wine will prevent cancer. Okay? And you dig into the story, it's based on a study with cells in a petri dish where they added resveratrol, which is an interesting compound found in very tiny quantities in red wine. And they showed a slightly different rate of cell proliferation, which is what cancer is, right? So it's interesting research, maybe points towards something that could go to a mouse, but you sure as heck can't take that and say, drink red wine and you'll never get cancer, right? That's stupid. That has no external validity. You can't take that and apply it to a human population, right? So, sorry, the reason I went through all that is field studies sometimes suffer from weaker internal validity. The studies are maybe not as perfectly set up. But the upside is, and what I advocate for with my research colleagues sometimes is, at least it's in the environment where it matters, right? So most of my research right now, which will change in a month, is in Tysol cows on a 1966 dairy. I think a lot of what we do does apply to your dairies, but there are some weaknesses in that, right, in terms of external validity. So in a perfect world, in my mind, we could design well-controlled studies in an environment just like your dairy, or ideally your dairy, but that's not always possible, okay? So those can be good or bad, depends on the details. And then demonstration trials, on-off, I'm not a huge fan of. I can show some examples why, but they are better than nothing, okay, than not having any information for sure. So let's talk through some more examples of that. So here's some data from, this is not a Michigan dairy. I think this dairy is actually in the Central Valley of California. 1,300 cow dairy, so it's not like we're looking at 12 cows. You look across this 33 weeks of the year. This is average by week. Where do you think they added an additive to the diet? Okay, I'm being mean. They didn't actually do anything to the diet the whole year. That's all just noise, okay? And it's kind of depressing because I don't know this dairy super well, but I know the consultant very well, and I know a little bit about the dairy. I think everyone in the room, if you knew the dairy, you would say it's a well-managed dairy. This isn't like they're doing a terrible job. But, you know, this is the beginning of the year in California. What happens in Central Valley in the beginning of the year? Lots of rain, right? So they're dealing with lots of rain and stuff here, and then what's going to be happening about here? The heat hits, right? Late summer heat, and so there's just a lot of noise, a lot of variables, and there's cows getting dried off, and there's cows freshening, and that's not always stable week to week. So it can be frustrating to look at this sort of thing and think about, well, when could we try to design and sort of on-off study that would really be sensitive to pick up some, pound or two differences that matter economically, and it's very difficult. Okay. In fact, I always remember my predecessor at Kansas State when I went there used to tell people, if you let him start a feed additive study in September, he could sell you sand all day and night, right? Because Kansas in September, cows are all recovering from heat stress. They're always going to look better in the next 4 weeks than they did the 4 weeks before that, right? So again, I'm not saying we should never do that, but you have to go in with some realistic views on how well you're going to learn from that kind of on-off type of study. So where do we start in terms of informing the decision? I think I always start with, do we know the mode of action? And there are some things that clearly work where I would say we don't really know the mode of action. That's okay. But if we're not sure if it works, let's at least start thinking about that. And then what I get beat up on sometimes, which is entirely true, is universities never test interactions, right? So we've got 50 feed additives out there we could feed. There's very little data on, if I'm already feeding this, does it make any sense to add this? Or maybe sometimes they actually are synergistic. Maybe they work better together, but we have very little data on that. So we have to start with, well, what's the logic at least? Can we think through the mode of action, and would it make sense that they would complement each other or not? A lot of companies will show observational kind of on-off data in their brochures from other farms. again, I'm not saying those are worthless at all, but I would caution you a few things. Companies vary in their ethics, to be honest. I know companies that I really trust, and when they share data, I actually believe it, but I know for sure there's companies that they'll throw in additives in 10 farms, and if 4 of them look good, they'll make a glossy brochure with those 4, and you never hear about the other 6. So at least think about that, right? That's called cherry picking, and it's very common. And then were the comparisons fair? And this isn't always necessarily the Gatorade example of designing a horribly unfair study on purpose. But when you don't spend a ton of time setting up a study, you're like, oh, these 2 pens are basically the same. I'll show you an example of an issue with that. But Eliza's example is actually the best. And, if somebody is trying to sell a product and they actually get a significant treatment effect and then keep digging, that's super impressive. Because most people will be like, sweet, I'm done. But it's a great example that happens all the time. And I'll talk about the program we're doing where we see this. And I don't think anybody's trying to bias anything. It's just like, okay, we're going to treat every other animal. And you kind of assume that things are going to be balanced. And so often they're not. I mean, we go way out of our way to try to design balanced studies. And often at the end, we're like, crap, these 2 groups were different going into the study. In some measure, something in the blood or something, and then you get beat up over it. So if you don't even account for those differences in like, oh, we had more 3rd parity cows in this group and 1st parity in this group, it's a huge bias. And it's, like I said, it takes a lot of time to design studies to avoid those biases. And then, I love this. This is a true story. It happened to me, so it's firsthand. So be careful with anecdotes. So I mentioned a few times I used to work at Kansas State. Did a lot of research there. The farm manager was fantastic. Worked his butt off on a very old dairy there again. But we were setting up a study one year, and I went to talk to him about it, kind of plan out the logistics and stuff. And he just said, okay, hey, this all looks fine, but we've had some problems with winter dysentery this year, and we threw this feed additive in, and cows, it really cleared them up. Is it okay if we just put it in all the diets? I'm like, oh yeah, it's balanced then. I don't have any problem with that. So I changed my formulation, then I went to talk to the feeder, and he's looking through, yeah, we got enough of all this, that's fine. Then he gets down to this, what's this moss thing here? Well, it's mannan oligosaccharide. That's what you started feeding about 6 weeks ago, I think. He's like, it doesn't ring a bell. So I'm like, well, maybe he's calling it something else. So he went to the feed shed where they have like the hand add stuff. We roll up the door, and oh, there's this pallet over here, and there's a shrink wrap pallet of a moss product. And I'm like, man, this stuff is good. It just has to have its aura on the farm, and the cows got healthier, So, the mastitis people talk all the time about self-cure, right? It's a thing, right? Animals get better, and sometimes we think, oh, we did a good job, and often the cow just got better, right? So anyway, just be careful with it. Okay. I think another thing to think about, and this is not always feasible, but I think it's a lot of what the AV-Vis people are thinking about, and I think if there's ways we can make it work, I think it's really smart. Are there ways to target an additive to cows that will respond most? So maybe on a whole herd we add something and it gives us a 2-to-1 return on investment, and maybe the evidence is kind of so-so, and so that 2-to-1 is like, maybe it's a 2-to-1, maybe it's a 1, maybe it's no return on investment, and you're not quite sure. But can you feed it to just some cows that have a 5-to-1 ROI, right? And then maybe for a 5-to-1 ROI, you're willing to put 10 or 15 cents at risk, because if you're right, that's a big return, right? That's kind of that probability thinking. And so this is where the logistics get frustrating. As nutritionists, we want to target feed some groups, and I know a lot of farms with labor pressures don't want to do that because they don't think it's worth it, but I'm always pushing. There's big things we can do if we can target, and even like maybe seasons, right, during heat stress or something. So this is a really nice slide. A friend of mine, Ken Griswold, put together for a talk a few years ago, and he was willing to share it. But I think he's really good about it. He used to do research at the university before he went to the industry, and he'd get beat up once he went to the company of like, you guys always show these university studies, and they show like 6 pounds of milk, and then I go to my dairy and I get 1.5 pounds, if that. And he's like, trying to listen and think, are they right? And well, he's kind of right at some level. The person beating him up on it, because when I'm in, putting together a study, most of the studies we run are at least $100,000 investment for whoever's funding it, because I got to pay grad students, I got to pay for cow use and all that. It's a big investment. So naturally, everybody involved and the time involved, if there's anything going on there, we want to give ourselves the best shot of seeing it. And it's not, again, to try to skew the findings, but it's like if there's something there, we want to set up the study to find it. So if you take 1,000 cow herd, this is a pretty typical distribution, 39% first lactation, about 30% second, 30% third plus. Are we just going to randomly pick among that? I'm not going to. If I want to design a study that gives us the best chance of finding something, so often we completely leave out first lactation animals. I don't always do that, it depends on the study, but usually, I think it's true, they don't respond as dramatically to, the way I think about it is, it's not as hard to meet their nutrient requirements for their potential milk production, right? So the odds are, it's less likely that doing something nutritionally is going to open up a bottleneck for them. And I'd say experimentally, that's what I've seen, okay? So we typically don't, so we've already cut out 40% of the cows on the herd and said we're not going to study them. Then, okay, there's 610 cows left. This is maybe a little overstated, but it is generally true. I'm not going to put cows certainly over 200 days of milk on most studies if I'm looking for milk production responses. Again, those cows are past peak. We're not maybe pressuring the metabolic system as much. They're probably not going to respond as well. So in this example, he's already kicked out another 410 cows. Okay. Now you're down to 200 cows that are multiparous in the first 100 days of milk. And then he's saying, well, the first 30 days of milk, those cows are a mess. You've got some that are unhealthy. We don't really want to deal with them. So now you're down to 140 cows that are in this narrow part of lactation that are multiparous. And we're using these very specially selected animals to represent the 1,000. Okay? That's an external validity problem. These cows are not randomly sampled out of this whole population. Okay? So then if you see 6 pounds here, and that's the most responsive group, you don't expect 6 pounds out of the whole herd, right? Maybe you're going to get 3 pounds, or something like that. So it is important to keep in mind. And again, there's reasons we do that from a research standpoint. But then if you take that same logic and say, well, if it's really true, those are the cows that are responding, do I have a way to hit them with a feed additive that will benefit them only instead of feeding the whole herd? Yeah.
What you could do, depending on what the cost, you could cut out a few, maybe the pre-fetch, but if you were able to label those and separate their data, you could say, well, it was 6 pounds on those cows. It was 3 pounds on the 610 cows. That would be, then you could get an expectation, because otherwise you wouldn't know what it did on the 600.
Absolutely right. And that's one thing I liked about what Elias showed is he's looking at the lactation number by treatment interaction, right? And he didn't really dig into that a lot, but potentially if you see that and it's like, oh, the cows that really responded to this treatment for whatever reason are the first lacs. Did you separate those into separate pens? That's useful information, right? You could also do it by days in milk, like we talked about here, right?
Well, in this situation, what would your control group look like? Would you be taking out of that subset of 140, splitting it in half then?
Yes, for a university study, but I know that's not always feasible to do on the farm, right? Yeah. But he also makes another point here that I want to point out real quick is the other thing we typically do in the university is we take a group of cows and we follow them for a period of time. It's the same cows, right? And so we're tracking what happens to those cows. And then people take that data and they put it on a farm and they don't see anything for a while. And then sometimes the response grows. And then so I get pushback from company representatives. They'll say, well, I'll design like a 28-day study. And they'll say, oh, all the herds I feed, it takes 3 months to see the full impact of this. And I tell them, I don't really believe the rumen microbes turn over like in hours. I don't really believe the rumen needs 3 months to adapt. I think what you're seeing is the cows that are really benefiting from this are the ones going through the transition period, and the full impact shows up when they hit peak milk. It's a different scenario than having a controlled study with 60 cows and saying we're going to march these cows through. You're always rolling new cows into the lactating herd. And so watching the time course of that response is inherently different than the studies that I'm designing. Okay, so the key point, one key point about that is, depending on the mode of action, okay, sometimes you have to be patient. And particularly when I do a lot of work on transition cows, people will be like, oh, will you help me run this for a month? And I'm like, that's a waste of your time. Like, if you're not going to try it for 3 months, don't even bother. That's my opinion. Okay, so one quick example, kind of aligned with the license a little bit. This is a study on a Michigan farm we helped with where they did a nice job of trying to do a randomized study on the farm. Every 3 cows that went through calving were randomized to get 1 bolus at calving. I'm not going to say what the boluses were, or 2 or 3, and they didn't use any first lactation heifers. And this is the data. This is basically pulling data out of Dairy Comp and putting it in Excel. Okay, so you already have to know how to take that data out. But then it's a pretty basic analysis. They plot out week 2 milk, week 4, week 8, week 10. The problem is they're just taking out averages because Dairy Comp will spit out those group averages, but it's not showing you the whole data set. It's just the average, right? So it doesn't show you that variance that we talked about earlier. So if you look at this, trial 1 is 1 bolus, 2 and 3. It kind of looks like maybe getting 2 boluses. The yellow line is benefiting cows by week 10. That 3 boluses was not. Okay, so I would say if you concluded that here, you wouldn't be way off. But it's not a very sophisticated analysis. It doesn't at all account for parity. And the problem is here is the treatments didn't end up balanced well across breeds and parities. In fact, they were not supposed to enroll heifers in there, but some heifers accidentally got treated, and then they typed them in the computer. So there was some major bias in this data set from having some first parity animals, which obviously don't make as much milk. So I use the same software. These guys are showing jump, and we can account for the milk change over time in the same model. So we're saying, overall, tell me how much milk these cows made on these different treatments. And this is what we got. We found an interaction of lactation group by treatment. So in the oldest cows, we really saw nothing. It didn't matter how many boluses they got. But in the lactation 2 and 3 groups, which had more cows, the 3 boluses were definitely negative. This was statistically significant. So the conclusion was, from this analysis, probably don't do 3 boluses. And I guess could have got the same answer here, maybe, because that red line is lower. But this gives you a much better sense of the uncertainty around that, right? More informed, more thinking about probabilities and the bets involved. Anyway, so partly to the point of, well, it's nice to dig into the data more and stuff, but I don't have the software. Yeah, I mean, that's 100% true. I thought about doing a chat GPT data analysis example in here, and then I thought that maybe that would be a mistake. But that will be solving the software problem. But the problem is you still have to know what to tell it how to do, right? And so it does help to have at least some form of statistics training. So, and it was awesome having a poultry example in here too, because I've been telling people when we talk about this program is like, look, the feedlot industry is way ahead of us on this. The poultry industry is way ahead of us on this. And we're getting to the scale on many dairies where we could have the kind of numbers that you want to ask some pretty nuanced questions on our own dairy. So anyway, I use the endowment that I have access to set up a program now where I'm going to be paying 3 grad students every year a little bit extra to help me tackle more of these kinds of questions that farms want to answer for themselves. I've already been doing some of this, but it's a bandwidth issue. So we just started this in January, and it's really off to a good start.
Hey, once again, thank you for listening to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast. Really appreciate you being here, listening to this episode. And if you found this interesting, please share it with somebody you know. That's how we grow our audience. And one other thing I just wanted to say, I would love to hear from you what you are enjoying about listening to the podcast, what we could do better, and also if you have a unique story to share, we'd love to hear it. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's usually the best way to get a hold of me, and would love to hear that from you guys. So until next week, I'm Paul Windemaller. Thank you for listening to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast.